Hello, everyone, and welcome to our DRI webinar. We are pleased to present to you ESG, Sustainability and Climate Resilience, a business continuity perspective. So we did some original reporting on this. We did a survey and a white paper, and we will talk about that with our two guest speakers. We have Lyndon Bird, who is the Chief Knowledge Officer here at DRI, and Eric McNulty, who is the Associate Director of the National Preparedness Leadership Initiative at Harvard University. I'm Chloe Domrovsky, President and CEO of Disaster Recovery Institute International. We'll discuss the findings of the report and how organizations can move forward to ensure future performance and success within an ESG framework, informing how they're pursuing business continuity and operational resilience. So before we really jump into the conversation, I want to get started on why we actually decided to do this. For a number of years, we've seen some overlap, and there's been progressively more and more overlap between certain areas of corporate social responsibility and sustainability with business continuity and risk management. But the two operate in silos. I think we're pretty used to that, seeing that within the corporate environment, that different disciplines will operate in different silos, particularly if they have different reporting mechanisms. But suddenly, with all of the focus on climate-related financial disclosure in particular, business continuity and risk management teams were being tasked with contributing to some of this information. So we wanted to measure this and see if this was happening. Was this anecdotal, or is this happening more widely? So that is what we will talk about today, and then we will present to you an opportunity to read the research further as a part of the white paper. To set the stage a little bit, we actually did this as a follow-up piece to our paper on the COVID-19 pandemic and some of the lessons learned there that we also partnered with NPLI on. And so the COVID-19 pandemic followed immediately on 2019's Business Roundtable statement that stated that the purpose of a corporation has evolved, that it's no longer just about serving shareholders and maximizing shareholder value, but also about serving all of our stakeholders, including our employees, our customers, our communities more broadly. And then, of course, during the COVID-19 pandemic, that was immediately tested when it could be so easy to just do widespread layoffs or go to cash or be extremely conservative in a very traditional way. Organizations were saying, well, if we're here to serve stakeholders, then we maybe need to think about this problem a little bit differently, and we have to put people first. And what we're seeing when we look at results from, say, the Edelman Trust Barometer is that business is consistently the most trusted institution, much more trusted than government, even nonprofits, and of course the media. People look to not only businesses, but in particular, they look to their own employer. They trust their employer for information, and they want their CEO to take a stand on social issues and environmental issues, especially when government is not, which of course can be tricky waters to navigate, as risk professionals are intimately aware. Simultaneously, we do an annual survey of global trends in risk and resilience, and we saw that while climate change and the impacts of climate change have always been sort of at the upper end of the 20 risks, last year it didn't quite make the top 10, but it jumped from position 19 to position 11, representing the largest single move of any one topic. So we're seeing that this is really hitting risk professionals, and they're looking at it very seriously and trying to figure out what they're expected to do as we see this change. Lastly, the last thing I'll say just to set the stage is that in 2022, the Bank of England completed its inaugural climate stress test. This involved the largest UK banks and insurers, and they stated that if no action is taken to address climate change, the resulting financial risks could result in losses of over £300 billion, with banks and insurers likely to pass a portion of these costs on to their customers. Banks projected that the sectors likely to be impacted the most were mining, manufacturing, transportation, and wholesale and retail trade. The ECB, the European Central Bank, came up with similar results, and the Federal Reserve hasn't yet conducted such tests, but it may be coming. We know that the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, issued a call for public guidance into how they can create rules related to climate-related financial disclosure as well. This will likely be held up in legal battles, but nonetheless, we are seeing that organizations are already preparing for it. As they do so, the sustainability teams are trying to find and organize data on how climate change is likely to impact their operations. And as a result, they are finding their way over to their operational resilience colleagues. So today we're going to explore a little bit more about why that is and how it's going. So to start us off, Eric, What is ESG in the first place, and how does climate-related financial disclosure fit in?
Chloe, thanks so much for having me here. I'm looking forward to it very much. So ESG is environment, social governance. It's pretty straightforward. If you think of financial returns as giving you your economic license to operate, ESG gives you your social license to operate. So it looks at all those impacts a business has, its activities around those environments, those areas of environment, social impact, and governance. And that's become so important because we have seen how stakeholders are expecting to be able to understand this. Investors are looking to understand how companies are dealing with it. As you mentioned, the forecast for the impact coming out of the financial sector is really showing more and more that companies have to pay attention to this. It's not a luxury anymore. Now, the climate-related financial disclosure, that's going to bring into perspective a couple of things. One, it's going to make companies match their claims with their performance. So if you say you want to be a net zero carbon emitter, you have to be able to show that you're on the pathway to getting to be a net zero carbon emitter. So trying to get rid of the greenwashing, as it were. And it is, again, as we look at insurers, reinsurers, others who are seeing there's actual risk here. So it's the ability for investors and others to say, you understand your risk, you're taking appropriate measures to address it, and here's a uniform way we can look at it across industries and across organizations and take some measurements and see how one company is doing versus another. So it's really meant to create some visibility and transparency into all of these measures at the same level we have on the financial side.
So, and just to follow up, Eric, thank you for that explanation, generally what it is, but why are organizations really doing this in the first place? Why is it that they're suddenly branching out into ESG and putting all this focus on it?
Part of it, I think, is stakeholder pressure, but part of it is also the realization of the impact of the changing climate in which we're operating. One study that I read showed that between 2014 and 2019, there were ESG blunders accounted for $500 billion in market cap loss in the U.S. alone. That's trillion with a T. And so these are not insignificant. These are not nice to do. And I also think some companies who want to lead are stepping forward and say, if we set the bar higher and we can meet that bar, we gain regulatory advantage over our competitors. Let's get in there, be good corporate citizens, show we can do really well on this. And that will give them a leg up over their competitors who are trying to catch up.
Thanks for that. So, Lyndon, I want to move over to you, and can you set the stage for us a little bit about how this report was conducted, how we got to the findings, just sort of technically, what was our approach?
Okay, yeah, sure. Thanks, Chloe. And I'm also delighted to be here in this important webinar today. Well, it really started, I have to be honest, with Chloe. Chloe and I were chatting around the issues and where particular new issues and new and emerging issues of business continuity we should do some focus. And we've been working with Eric for some time on a number of activities over recent years. And we asked Eric his thoughts, and Eric was very keen to discuss more and more with us. And eventually it became pretty obvious to us that what we needed to do was some sort of research project, report, analysis of where we were at the moment and where we perhaps could be headed and where perhaps the pitfalls and problems could be of getting there. So a proper sort of report on that. And so that's really what we set out to do. And in order to do it, we had to basically, and by the way, I just preface that with saying we're not at the end product yet. So we've got a report tomorrow, but we've also got ongoing data being collected through our annual survey, risk and resilience survey. We're continuing dialogue with other key players in this area, in this industry. So there'll probably be additional reports and additional guidance coming from us in the future. But as of today, this particular report came from 3 sources. The first one what was essentially the very most basic way of doing it. We talked to people we knew who were involved in this field, senior executives, senior business continuity, senior resilience professionals. Eric, in particular, had contact with particular senior people involved with the sustainability aspects of businesses. And we put a lot of that together and their feedback. And we had a small round table with a number of people brought together. We chatted them around. So that gave us a kick-off to the whole project. We then took it to Austin for our annual conference. Eric and I gave a presentation on the whole thing, where we saw it, where it was going, what the views were, and we opened this to the audience, and probably had about 50% of our presentation was actually question and answer, and we got a lot of interest and discussion and debate, much more than you often get on other subjects. So clearly what Chloe says is correct. There is a lot of interest out there. And then the final leg on that was a survey questionnaire. We put out 9 key questions that we identified. We put those out to the attendees at the conference, not just the people who attended our sessions, but the entire attendees and other people who wished to complete it. And we compile those results. So those 3 main sources of information are what has formed our opinion or our report to date. Obviously, we sounded it off other people. I chair the Future Vision Committee for the institute, of which actually Eric is a member, a very active member, in fact. And so shared it with them, got thoughts from them, played that back, as well as other people. But overall, those were the 3 sources which came together with the report we're going to be talking about today and be distributing, I believe, sometime after this meeting. Chloe.
Thanks, Lyndon. So Eric, back to you. We're going to dig into the findings a little bit, but also based on your research. First of all, what are the main reasons organizations are in fact adopting ESG principles? And based on that, does ESG contribute to better business results, or is it just a nice to have?
I think we're increasingly seeing the evidence that you can't ignore this. From the climate-related disruption of severe weather, we have seen increasing the social unrest in various places around the planet, the various scandals that pop up from time to time in the corporate world. These are the evidence is more and more difficult to ignore. So this is becoming a must-have. And I think that as you saw the jump in where climate went in the risk awareness in your survey from 19 to 11, that increase in risk awareness leads to a couple of things. And part of the organization, the alarm bells go off, and they're like, "Uh-oh, we better get ready for this. How are we going to mitigate, be ready to respond if something happens?" In other parts of the organization, the opportunity bells go off. They're like, "This is a chance for us, if we can get ahead of this, again, to have strategic advantage in the marketplace, to position ourselves well, improve our reputation, and improve our performance." And so those 2 sets of bells need to be in harmony, right? I think that's what we see, that the opportunity here is to bring those 2 sides together and say, this does make a lot of sense. And it isn't just what was once sort of what's your carbon footprint sort of thinking. Now it is, how does this affect our supply chain? How does it affect our workers and their families? How does it affect our customers? Because everyone is feeling these impacts, and certainly COVID woke us up to that there could be a disruption that affects literally everybody. And so it really has opened eyes a lot. And then in terms of being able to put in place, again, this is a chance for leadership, and I think it's what we're seeing here as organizations adapt. The ESG reporting is not new, but it was a very sort of thin slice of organizations that were doing it in any depth. And now we're seeing it. They want to have that deeper view into the supply chain, into different aspects of their organization. This is one way to get it. And it's a new way to get it. And I think it's giving people new and valuable information. So I think that's why they're adopting it. And I think it's going to be continue to be widespread, more and more widespread, even if the regulations take a while to get into place. Because again, investors are going to demand it, insurance companies are going to demand it, your bank's going to demand it. They really want to make sure that you have some transparency into what's going on. So that, I think, that's where the action is going to be. And I think those who are playing catch up are going to have a hard time catching up, because the early movers in this are going to have a definite advantage.
Yeah, we've definitely seen a lot on the sort of risk management side of dealing with climate resilience. The insurance companies put out a lot of information and a lot of data on this. But what you were saying about worse now, the focus has shifted to adaptation and not just dealing with kind of mitigation and what businesses are going to do, but how those business changes are going to impact how we do things, as well as how the changing climate will impact how we do things. And adaptation, responsiveness, that's all about business continuity. So suddenly they are having to collaborate and coordinate, not just for regulatory reasons, but also because impacts are here. So
that's right. And to answer the second half of your question there, I mean, I think that if you look at the investment results over the last several years, those companies that are leaders in ESG have consistently outperformed their peers who are laggards. I mean, this is looking at pure financial returns, being a hard-nosed financial type. You can look at it and say these companies actually are doing better for a whole lot of reasons, but the ESG is a big part of it because they are being good citizens. That helps to lead to, more engaged employees, happier customers, less regulatory pressure. Communities are happy to have your business nearby. All those things play into why this is important and why this can drive superior results.
Right. And as one of our attendees commented, it's also particularly helpful in terms of attracting talent. Increasingly, employees want to work for these companies who are active in these areas and are publishing about it and contributing to it. So, Lyndon, based on the report findings, are sustainability and business continuity overlapping within organizations? Do they have a similar reporting structure? How does that all work? What are we seeing from the data?
Okay, I'll just get to the data in a second, but I think first of all we need to just check really on what we mean by sustainability, what it actually means. And there's a tendency, I think, in sort of general conversation to assume that sustainability and ESG are the same thing, or perhaps the sustainability is just the part of the sort of E piece of the ESG. So therefore, it's seen that sustainability is some sort of environmental initiative. Well, from my perspective, we would certainly hope, and we'd expect to see a company that has strong ESG principles and strong ESG processes in place to be a very sustainable one. Certainly, that's right, but that is almost putting what I could say is putting the sort of we would say in this country, I don't know if you have the same expression, putting the horse before the cart. I mean, really what we're looking at is a sustainability issue here. And what is sustainability? And the sustainability, and I have to read this one, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, I found very interesting because when I took some time to look at what they were saying about sustainability and what a sustainability company is, many of the activities that they said should happen would certainly be covered by the overall ESG agenda, but they were also including things in there such as human capital, agility, market awareness, innovation, leadership, as well as the obvious environmental issues. So it seemed to me that that's a wide acceptance, almost going back to what Eric was saying, is that this isn't sort of something that you're just tagging on. This is something that's actually integral to the whole way that you run your business, and all these things come together now, as opposed to this is being something you tag on and report on. This is now an integral part of everything you do. And also, when I listened to Eric's last point, another thing came to me was that, well, actually, the reason that these companies are successful is because they are doing what they should have been doing all the time, whether they call it ESG or not. The things that they are doing and ESG is triggering them to do are the basic things that they should be doing. I mean, why would you not want to run a company in the way Eric described it? It's obviously, it would seem to me obvious, you're going to be more successful if you have the correct people doing the right jobs, getting satisfaction, enjoying working there, than if you have one that hates going to work, etc., etc. So it seems to me that it is, in a way, it is self-defeating to argue against it, because it is common sense that it will work, and that seems to me to be something to digress. When we get on to sustainability in our survey, though, Chloe, it gets, of course, a bit more mechanistic, because again, people then answer the question based on their organizations, which is, of course, what we asked them to do. So one of the things that came out of it was that some organizations do have sustainability departments, and some of these actually totally overlap, in some cases completely, but within the same management reporting structure with resilience or business continuity, whatever it's been called in that environment. About 20% reported that. Which is, I thought, was quite good, seeing as sustainability is relatively new, whereas resilience and BCM is long established. But the important thing was nearly 50%, whoever had an informal relationship, they said, well, it's not in the same organization part, but we have to work together. Sustainability and resilience people have to work together, because what we do is so interlinked. So actually over 70% in total had a connection between the two. And seeing as that's a relatively recent trend, that's gone up to that level, I think very high. Only 30% said we don't currently have that. And to be fair, we didn't ask the question, do you think you're ever going to? We just asked them, have you got it at the moment? So it could be that some of those would have said, yes, we haven't got it now, but give us a year or two and we will have. So yeah, this seems to me to be clearly that, that's the way it's going. You ask where they report. At the moment, it's a bit embryonic anyway, I guess, but when they technically report together, it's usually to some sort, within some sort of chief risk officer type area, somewhere in an NERM framework of some sort. Some organizations already got something like a chief resilience or chief sustainability officer in place, and often there's a connection within in that level. But I think it's a bit too early to say very clearly where these are going to end up reporting. After all, we've done business continuity for 30 years, and we still argue about where it should report. And we've asked those questions in our surveys some years and get some interesting issues. So the answer to your question is, I think it's made a surprisingly quick connection. Still room to go. A lot of people are recognizing it, whether in formal relationships, quicker than perhaps the formal management structures are catching up on. But it seems to be going that way, and that seems to be reflecting where we are. And just finally on this piece, I did, in the course of putting this report together and work with Eric and in particular on this, we sort of came to the conclusion, I guess, that sustainability and resilience were pretty much the same thing, but at different timescales. You could almost say, well, what is sustainability? Really, it is long-term resilience. And what is BC? Perhaps it's short-term resilience. So somewhere along that line, there is an overlap. Yes, what is seen as strategic, what is seen as operational. Perhaps incorrectly, but that's where they're seen today. So, but they are certainly on the same continuum. So that's I think where we are now. I think quite a positive position at the moment.
Absolutely. And that reflects the conversations that we were having with some of the DRI board of directors members, a shout out to their thought leadership in general. You gave me credit for starting this conversation, but it was really just because I heard a sidebar with a bunch of our board members who were discussing this, and they were saying, hey, the sustainability team is asking me for data on how extreme weather impacts our operations. Are you seeing the same thing within your organization? And so that's kind of what precipitated this conversation, and I'm wondering whether it was actually happening more broadly. So Eric, before we lose you entirely to another conversation, I want you to drill down a little bit more specifically into climate resilience within the ESG framework in two kind of areas. I've mentioned that there is the adaptation to what's actually happening with the changing climate, but then there's also the adaptation to how, businesses are changing investor pressure, and the transition to a low carbon economy. So how do organizations kind of strike the balance in terms of adapting and investing in what a net zero future looks like, for example?
Well, I think first of all, with an extraordinary number of respondents said this was important. I think it was 80% said that climate resilience was important to them. So it really is top of mind. And I think, while it varies across organizations and sectors, sort of three general buckets responses fall into. One is, how are we contributing to the problem and how do we lessen that? So this is how do we reduce our carbon footprint? How do we use less water? Those kind of things. Then there is how do we contribute to the solution? And this is where you see people going carbon positive, not just carbon neutral or water positive. They're introducing products and services that actually help solve that larger issue. And not just limit their contribution to it. And then the third one is, and these are a bit independent of it's a Venn diagram, is how are the contextual changes affecting everything we do? So we've just seen recent reports of how much the economy has lost to heat-related work stoppages and/or outages, worker outages, those kinds of things in places that never really had to worry about that before. So they're saying, okay, this is changing, and really beginning to understand, if our customers can't get to us because of extreme weather, what does that do to us? How do we actually figure out new ways of doing business, or, adapt in ways that are going to make us able to thrive in a new reality? And so I think that's where the really deep thinking is going on. Sort of level one is, how do we minimize our contribution to the problem? Then you get to, how can we help build the future and build the solution? And then the third and much deeper is looking just beyond your own four walls, but how is this affecting across the board, our suppliers, our customers, our workers, all of our stakeholders, and how is it going to affect how we're able to serve them, how we're able to be in business with them. And I think that's where you're going to find the real innovation, the real creative thinking around this, because again, there's been a lot of work on climate issues for a long time. I've been following this for 20 years, and too often it was perceived as, oh, those people, they're overreacting and it's going to cost us a lot of money, so make them go away. Now we've seen the impacts actually are coming faster than anticipated, and so it is now, okay, how can we take that knowledge and think differently about what we're doing and reimagine, restructure how we're doing business in order to take greatest advantage of it. So that's where I see it really coming in. And we've had enough climate disruption from every, be it rising sea levels to wildfires to flash floods and severe rain. Everybody knows what it looks like now. And once you know what it looks like, it sort of fires the imagination to say, uh-oh, how do we do something smart about this? And that's where I think it's really going.
Totally. And we got some reinforcing feedback from an audience member as well, saying, for years now, I've been sensing that ESG, CSR professionals prefer to deal with stresses, chronic stresses, and business continuity and risk management professionals are more calibrated to dealing with shocks. That's sort of how the breakdown has been. But as we're seeing now, take something like extreme heat, we're seeing a chronic stressor turn into shocks. You said it can lead to work stoppages, right? It can also lead to infrastructure failure. There's all these sorts of cascading impacts, and we have to adapt. So I know I'm looking for more trees on my block and white roofs as sooner rather than later, so that we can adapt effectively. So Lyndon, when it gets into the actual tactical implementation and data collection, this is where business continuity professionals are becoming very useful. So what kinds of inputs can they provide to the process of climate-related information requests in terms of expertise, methodologies, experience, or other skills, for example? What did the report tell us?
Okay, well, what the report basically is telling us about all of this is that there's a lot of reporting and accounting required from organizations that in the past they've not necessarily had to provide, or if they've had to provide, they've had to not worry too much about how accurate it is because nobody was actually going to be in a position to do anything about checking it. So the new demands, which seem to me to be have grown enormously in the last 2 years in so many issues, I think, for the reasons Eric has expressed, that we've all suddenly perhaps woken up to the fact that these things are real and they're not just something that might happen in 50 or 100 years' time. They're actually affecting us now, and they're affecting us operationally now, not just in some sort of strategic way. The reporting is going to be needed in the future. It's going to have to be accurate. It's going to have to be comprehensive. It's going to be relevant. And who in an organization is it that actually collects data and information about things that can go wrong and the impacts of them should they do so, and measure what is happening, measure what what has happened in the past, measure what measures can be put in to mitigate situations and analyze impacts on all sorts of ways. Now, what I'm saying is BCM and techniques we use in that, some of the risk and assessment techniques, particularly the BIA techniques, are one of the few ways in an organization that a department actually basic role is to find out these questions. Not necessarily to find out the answers, but to ask the questions and find out the problems. And doesn't take a leap of faith really to come to the conclusion that it doesn't take that much in the way of modification of questionnaires, some more training perhaps in the subject matter area of some of the business continuity people to be able to be a little bit more direct in the way they approach their interview process, for example. But overall, if I look at an organization, and maybe I'm biased because this is the part of the world that I'm involved in, but maybe I don't see anywhere else in an organization where people have quite the same focus in what could go wrong, what's the likelihood of that going wrong, risk assessment view it a slightly different way. And what is the overall impact? What can't we do? Because reality is, and again, Eric made a very good point there, is once we start seeing what it's going to stop us doing, we start getting worried about it. When we don't think it's going to affect us in any way, but it could just be, oh, the weather can be a bit hotter. Well, I don't worry. I want to go at the sea more often. I mean, people don't worry, but once they start to see the firing, the hotter temperatures, all the destruction that's happening, then they start to realize it. Same with companies. Once they start to see what is potentially going to happen to them, then they start to do something about it. Who is going to find that out? Who is going to do that analysis? Factually, I would say is the business continuity people. So it's a bit wider than answered your question, but because I think they have the skills to do it, then with some modifications to the tools that we use now, and probably not that great ones, then the technique should be absolutely well organized to provide the information. And to be honest, I'm not quite sure where else in the organization the information will come from if they don't actively engage with and bring trained business continuity professionals into that whole dialogue. So that I think is what is going to happen, because it has to happen. And we can provide it because we've got the skills. We've got a whole pile of the toolkit already in place, and only needs a little bit of modifying. So I think that the future is going to require a lot more integration of this function into wider business questions, such as the one you put to me about climate-related information requests. Again, where they're going to get the information from if they don't ask our people.
Yeah, and we're certainly seeing that it is, from the consulting side, that it is a relatively cost-effective way to start to gather this data internally, particularly across a large multinational corporation, to tack it on to some of what the business continuity team already does in terms of vetting risk, supplier risk, for example, or looking at the different vulnerabilities in different areas. I'm loving the feedback, the wonderful comments, as well as questions that we're getting in the chat from the audience. So I'll point out, Christopher here just said, it seems that from a climate resiliency lens, one of the ways that organizations are measuring risks is from an enterprise value at risks, or EVR, when seeking capital resources to mitigate climate risks. So we are definitely seeing a variety of ways in which this information can be fed into reporting and through organizations. But that was climate resilience, which seemed to me such an obvious one, probably because of the work I do with the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction and really looking at natural hazards and those impacts. But in conversations, we've also learned that business continuity helps organizations gain a lot of points, not just on the E of the ESG, but also on the S and the G, social and governance. So I'm curious, some ways that you see that could happen. Perhaps, Eric, you could take social, and Lyndon, you could take governance.
Sure, absolutely. And I want to say, Lyndon made a great point there about companies shouldn't think that as they confront these new challenges, they have no one in the building who can help figure this out. If they look down the hall, there are people who have methodologies and experience and ways of doing the analysis that can help them quantify the risk and understand what to do about it. So I hope they don't sort of look around and, as so often happens, they go try and reinvent the wheel. You've already got folks who are around who could do a good job of this. When I think about the social aspect of this, I think everyone on this call is probably familiar with the term VUCA, which has been around now for 30 years, of volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. It's a way of describing the environment. I now use the term VUCAST, and the S and the T tagged on there. S is for system scale change, and so that is the climate change we're seeing and some of the social changes we're seeing. But the T is really important, which is ubiquitous transparency. That it is possible now, we all carry around these little digital production studios in our pockets. Almost everyone can see almost everything in almost real time. And so in terms of your social performance, things can come to light rather quickly, sometimes unexpectedly, and people are looking in ways they never did before. And so you've got to realize that a corporation is a social entity. It's a license granted by society to be in business. It's not like you have the divine right of corporations. And so there are expectations around how you're going to perform. And if you look at some of the biggest disruptions of recent years, the reaction here in the US and then globally after the killings of George Floyd, it happened because someone was there to videotape it and put that up instantly. So that there was no chance for cover up and burying things. And that's a particularly dramatic example, but it happens all the time with companies everywhere. You can look back and find multiple examples. The passenger who was dragged off United Airlines aircraft about 5 or 6 years ago. Same kind of thing. It happens all the time. So on the social side, I think this needs to be part of holistic thinking. And 70% of the respondents to the survey said that they were, climate was part of a larger, broader ESG initiative. So they were trying to look at social and governance as well. And you have to realize that people are going to hold you to high standards there as well. Not always clear, in different parts of your customer base and your communities will have different opinions on some of these issues, but they expect you to be clear on your values and your principles and be an organization they can count on. Whether they always agree with you or not is a different subject, but when they can count on you, they have more trust in you. So you've got to take these social aspects incredibly seriously.
Lyndon?
Okay, governance then. Often the forgotten element in ESG, because environment gets all the attention and social increasingly so. But I see governance as the whole thing that makes it all work. And we can have whatever we want to do. If we haven't got proper governance, it won't work. Just because we want to do something doesn't mean it will work. You can say that's leadership, that's management, but also who leads and who manages, who controls what's going on in there. So bringing the whole thing together in a process that will work together, I think, is governance. So I see it, if you want to put it in very simple terms, as I like to do, is saying what we're aiming to achieve, striving to do it in an ethical manner, measuring whether we've done so, and if necessary, making the changes that will improve it. And this should always be done in an honest and transparent and really consistent manner. And that to me seems to be what it's about. Now, people might say the transparency can be an issue. What about confidentiality? And of course, I recognize that you have to have commercial confidentiality for the right reasons. But I think sometimes the lack of transparency is not for commercial confidentiality, but it's to protect previous mistakes or problems that have occurred, or just because people don't want to share information that actually should be in the domain to be shared, and will be these days because it's almost impossible to keep things private. So the need for being transparent for all the right reasons should take place. But I guess sometimes people try and do these things, explained in a couple of words. So to me, the two key words for me are accountability and transparency. And I think everything else comes from that. And as I said before, I think if we run businesses properly, it shouldn't even be contentious. The G part should not be contentious. Everyone agrees that companies in a modern era must run differently than the way they did the previous era, if only because of the accessibility of all the information about them, which requires them to operate differently, as Eric's mentioned. And I think ESG probably gives an additional push to what companies have to do anyway, in order to ensure they can continue to be successful. So to me, though, I love the idea of more transparency, more honesty, more ethics, and consistency.
Well, you've got a lot of agreement coming in from the audience as well. Jennifer thinks that governance is where the whole thing comes together. It's where the transparency is critical. And David thinks that, yes, if governance is done well, everything will work better. It's equally important. Similarly, when we're looking at different disciplines collaborating, it reminds me a lot of the conversations that we've had through the years about how business continuity and risk management should work together. And Don was even alluding to that here, saying it might be a good idea for BCM to partner with internal audit and risk management, depending on how the company is organized, to take on the ESG risk assessment and identifying possible controls to help reduce and mitigate risks. Absolutely, but then business continuity has to then look at the adaptation and how we're going to deal with the impacts that we're seeing as they're happening. So all of these different disciplines have to coordinate and somehow put together some sort of standardized report that we can then compare across different organizations in the way that we, compare shareholder reports. So something that is consistent and measurable and repeatable, which is not an easy problem to address. So when we're thinking about that, I guess in terms of the reporting and just in general, to both of you, I would ask, how can ESG and resilience really work together more closely? Like what were we start seeing in terms of not just are they, but how should they be working together?
Well, I'll jump in there, and I think that first I would say that, and you just made a great point, Chloe, that these different silos, which may have been okay working separately when times were relatively calm, we're in much more turbulent times now, and everything we've talked about reflects that. And so there is I think, a compelling need for everyone who has some piece of when things go sideways, right? Everything from risk management to BC, all those different functions that have some hand in solving that puzzle should be connected and be connected intelligently. And so I think the first thing to do is to open communication, and just, even if you don't do a formal realignment or a formal restructuring, just sit down and say, which piece of this are you seeing? What's keeping you awake at night? What solutions are you looking for? And see who else might have them. And just getting people around the proverbial table to talk about it and see. Communication is the first part. Once you start communicating, then you can begin to cooperate. Oh, I'm happy to share this or share that. And eventually you get to coordination and eventually collaboration. But just sort of starting down that pathway of make sure you're talking to each other, sharing information, developing some shared understanding and some shared vocabulary is a great way to get there. And from there, you can then get from cooperate to coordinate to collaborate, where you really are working hand in hand. But I think that you can open that dialogue. You'll find that people will have questions they're trying to get answered, and some of those answers will be in the room. They'll find some allies. They'll find some smart people who are smart about different aspects of the problem, and you'll begin to, I hate to say organically, but organically begin to build the relationships that you really need to be able to be intelligent about this. Because, again, in turbulent times, crises are culture-defining moments. And what people are going to look for, you can't have necessarily anticipated every disruption, but when it came, were you ready for it? Did you respond appropriately? Had you thought through what might happen and you're ready for it? Those are the ways people are ultimately going to judge your success or failure. And getting these groups together to begin to build those bonds is how you're going to do it.
Yeah, I'll jump in there then. I think that what we saw during the analysis we did post-COVID was this exactly is what needed to happen. It started off with with BC, particularly an area that I like to look at, but not the only one, being often left out because it wasn't seen as that's what he did. But then other people started to realize, well, they have things that we need. And so they were brought into the process, which then they realized that there were things that they did, but they couldn't do it without other people. And suddenly the whole thing was coming together across as we would have seen it, where the communications were coming from all directions and all levels, not in the way that typically we may have looked at the organization chart. And once that communication started to take place, then the overlap and the support for each other became obvious, and performance and became much, much better. Now, that was triggered by an issue that no one had expected to happen. This is an issue, or the issues we're talking about now, is everyone expected to happen, but that isn't any reason why we don't have to work together to make them a success. So, and I think we've actually been trying to do this for a while, if I really reflect on it. I mean, why has there been a push towards the concept of organization, or at least operational resilience, as a wider issue than business continuity? Basically because business continuity people, in reality, accepted their silo was not going to deliver everything, and there were too many silos, and we had silos for lots of different things. And certainly 3-4 years ago, we could have had a session like this. We would probably been discussing, how do we get rid of some of the silos. That discussion has perhaps dropped away a little, but I'm not sure that the silos have actually dropped away necessarily, and that's what perhaps still needs to happen. So the sort of de-siloing, if such a concept existed, what we need to do, and we need to bring better communication. We need to bring decisions. Decisions don't work in vertically; they work across all sorts of levels and pieces of the organization, and we don't always know what we need to know to make a decision, and that's what is what we need to do better. So I think in general, getting back to your question, there's absolute need for all of these areas start to find a way of working better together.
It is amazing how we end up in these silos. It's the perennial corporate issue. I don't think it's ever really going away, but that's why we continually have to talk about it. I mean, when you think about corporate social responsibility, there's nothing more responsible than a business continuing during a crisis or during an incident so it can continue to deliver for its customers, its shareholders, its communities, its employees. That is the essence of corporate social responsibility. And that's why I think what we've been seeing is that business continuity gets highlighted and gives corporations a lot of points for being responsible for taking care of their community. That's why you see it on websites and in reports, but now we're being asked to measure it more specifically rather than just mention it and say that it's something that we have or that it's nice to have. And that's where it gets really tricky. And we all have a lot of work to do. Clearly, judging by the number of questions we've gotten during this webinar and before it. So I want to jump into those. But before we do, I just want to tease a little bit more of the report itself. It made several recommendations for how we should approach and think about this problem as a profession. So maybe before we jump into the audience questions, can each of you speak to one or two of them that you found particularly interesting or useful? Eric?
Sure. One I think is incredibly important is to take advantage of the interest from CEOs and CFOs right now. Because when you get their attention and you have the chance to contribute to creating strategic value, do not waste that opportunity. It's a good opportunity for you to educate them on what you do, what you can do when you're contributing fully and you're fully integrated into what's going on. So you can create real allies there. And it's also important, you can have the conversation around, so what decisions are you wrestling with, CEO or CFO? Let me tell you how I can help inform the decision you're going to make. Because that plays to them at where they want to be, where the decisions they're going to have to make. When you can help make them smarter about those decisions or help them understand the risks involved and the opportunities as well, you want to take that because then you become a truly valued part of the organization, and that's going to pay dividends for a long time. So I think that's the one that really jumped out to me as the one I think people really don't waste this opportunity because it is a chance to really get in at the C-level and have an impact, and not just for the sake of having the impact, but actually for making the organization more sustainable over time.
Lyndon?
Okay. There's one that's actually quite similar to that. It sort of follows on from it and is a bit close to my heart. And that is about really that our practitioners, business continuity practitioners, need to reassess their own perception about what they can contribute. I think for too long, many people have put themselves in a silo, in a box, and this is what we do, which is unnecessary because you're not going to get the dialogue and the buy-in and the involvement Eric spoke about in the previous point, unless you're actually putting yourselves about. So you have to be more proactive in recreating what our role should be, what they could be, and selling those ideas internally. So to me, I think there is an onus on our profession to do more, not just should we say to not just to expect the business to see that these are the types of issues that can be brought into the more strategic role. We have to tell them that, because otherwise, as in the case of COVID, they'll actually go off and form other departments to do those strategic thinking, and then they'll find they can't do it because they don't know the details. So we need to be more proactive. And just the second one of that, which again I will comment on, is I had mentioned it before. If we do, and we've seen in the report, there's a lot of interest in actually having a chief sustainability or resilience officer to bring everything together. And I think that seems to be a trend that's going that way. Quite a few companies have it or already thinking about it, and many people think they should have it. So that seems to me something that we should be encouraging. We can't obviously go to chief executives and tell them how they reorganize their C-suite, but we can at least do what we write, what we say, what we present, how we present ourselves within our organizations, and perhaps help move that forward. So I think that's an important way of enhancing the importance of what we do.
Well, let's build on that, Lyndon, actually, because we got a question in advance and then a couple in the chat and some comments as well, all talking about executive buy-in and executive leadership. So Mary Beth in advance said, what has been your experience regarding the buy-in from boards and executive leadership for this work? Lyndon, do you want to start us off on this perennial favorite?
Yes. I did pick this one up before. I did have a, I thought I'd made a couple of points. I'd say that what we've seen so far, and this is not necessarily what we'd like to see, but I think what we've seen so far is that ESG is very top of the corporate agenda, well, very near the top of the corporate agenda currently. It will continue to be so while companies are not performing, or they're worried they are not going to perform, and this will have consequences. Once they feel that is under control, or the fashion has moved on, or other things are replacing it in terms of what they're reading in sort of the Harvard Business Review, and to give your organization a general sort of comment, and similar type of publications, then it may not be quite so top of the agenda. We've seen this before with other issues. So I'm not being cynical about that, but I'm just saying we know we've got that slot, and we therefore have to build on that slot. To me, if I look at sustainability, what buy-in we're getting, and what sort of executive buy-in we're getting on that, again, reasonable, because it's seen as strategic, it's seen as long-term, it's seen about the sort of what does the business need to do in the long term, how need it move forward. So there's quite a good buy-in, but I still think there is some scariness about maybe the cost, or the dislocation, or the problems, or the issues of going too far down that route. So interest, yes. Commitment to doing everything that's needed, quite a way yet, I think, to go. Getting BC on the table, as yet, probably pretty low. As I said before, I think we have to be smarter for ourselves for it to happen. And I think we have to talk, at all those different opportunities we get about issues that interest the top management. We're not going to get anywhere with talking about things that interest us, however important they may be. So I'd say that's a mixed bag, in my opinion.
Eric, I'm going to throw you a different question just because we're a little pressed for time. So Carmen asked, how can companies' environmental initiatives contribute to the mitigating the risk of disasters within their community, not just within the organization itself?
I think they have a great role to play, and that is part of being a good neighbor and understanding what the community is around you. And that can be everything from, again, being aware of what damage you may be doing to the community through pollution or other factors. Are you paying a fair wage? Are people getting benefits? Those kind of things that help them be naturally more prepared for disruption. And so if a disaster hits, they are better source there. But also thinking through, what are you going to do if the worst happens? And again, every crisis that I study, every disaster that I get the chance to look at, we see some companies step forward, and they know what to do because they've already been community minded. So they're ready to reach out and say, how do we help reopen schools? How do we provide supplies for shelters? How can our employees get engaged to help solve some problems locally? And that kind of community involvement tends to build engagement during blue sky times. It gets people feel like they're good to be part of the organization. They feel like you're a good corporate citizen, and so there's dividends there. But then you've thought through, and again, we could go back through individual stories of companies that have stepped forward to do this, but they're ready, and it's part of the natural mindset. That's part of, Lyndon's point earlier, getting buy-in. Are you getting that focus of, we're part of the community, therefore we should be a positive part and not a negative part. And I think more and more companies are getting that.
Yeah, so building on it, we got this question from both Mitzi and Stephanie. What key metrics can we leverage to support climate-related financial disclosure, getting down into the nitty-gritty as people have to deliver on this? What kind of metrics do we need?
I don't know what metrics we need, because essentially it's not particularly something I've studied in great detail, but I know what metrics we could provide. And I'm sure that other people can tell us the metrics that we need. I mean, I think the as far as I'm concerned, metrics are a question of determining what you need them for, and how you're going to actually get those metrics, and how you're going to present them, and how you guarantee you're going to validate those metrics, whatever they are. So, I've got, points that have said of the types of things that we already will know about from organizations. We'll know about, previous issues. We'll know about previous incidents of wildfires and how the likelihood of that is changing, about flooding, about, if we're in hurricane areas, how those patterns are changing. We will know that. Other people will know it, but I think we will have some more detail about how it affects our specific regional areas. We may have operational sites that are particularly exposed. They may be in remote areas. We may be one of the largest employers in that particular area, so we have particular issues to deal with there. So I think the metrics that are provided are the metrics that are requested, and I would imagine that what people want to know with the metrics is what are you doing, and where are your weaknesses, and what are you doing to correct those weaknesses? Where's your plan? It's all right coming along and saying, as you say, I think Eric made that point, you can come along and say we'll be carbon zero next year if you want to say it, but how are you going to prove you are, and what are you currently doing that gives us any confidence you're actually on the right track and you will get there? So I think the metrics are all about where you're going and proving. It's about doing the right things and proving you're doing them in a way. But I don't know what the specific ones are, but Eric may have some more specific thoughts on that.
Metrics are tough. One report I read in preparation for this from one of the large financial services companies had 500 metrics of how they evaluate companies across 75 different indices.
Yeah.
And so that's really, I would say, find the ones that matter to the business and you can measure consistently across the business. So one large company I've worked with in the food and beverage business, every senior executive is measured on 3 things besides their individual business results. One is plastic use and how do you bring it down? The second is water use and how do you bring it down? And the third one is diversity. Those are 3 things they felt were important to them globally and across every business line. And so those became the overarching metrics. And then the individual ones within your individual business units in different regions of the world, those will fluctuate a bit because of local circumstances. Find the metrics that matter because it's really easy to get overwhelmed with. And part of where sustainability, the original sustainability movement, when I think went a bit off the rails, was they get so deep into how many metrics they could provide, the reports became incomprehensible and became meaningless because there were just too many things in there. So find the ones that matter and drive deep on those.
Yeah, I just one quick illustration of that is I think when we were in a different era of business continuity, people became obsessed by how many BIAs we'd actually conducted, not actually what the outcomes and the results and what we're going to do with it, but have we conducted one every year or 2 every year, 1 every 2 years, and this somehow that metric was seen to be an important one, where it's actually a totally unimportant one because it doesn't lead anywhere.
Yeah, and the sustainability and climate-related disclosure, people are definitely having a lot of these conversations as well, feeding into something broadly agreed, but maybe non-specific, like the Sustainable Development Agenda out of the UN, but then looking at drilling down like the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, or SASB, has done by sector. So you get very specific by sector. Business continuity could map what we can deliver based on those metrics, and that's how we can be a star contributor. We've also gotten some interesting ideas in the chat as well. Perhaps Terry recommends metrics could be an ESG maturity scorecard. We got some questions, interesting questions from Monica about monitoring the end-to-end cost of electricity versus coal versus gas, and also the immense consumption of water by new data centers optimized for AI. So there's a lot of issues as we adapt to a new economy. Are we making sure that we're not making a bigger problem than we had in the first place? Well, we have plenty to discuss, but this is about all we have time for. I want to thank you both so much for joining us. I'm sure this conversation will continue, and I am grateful for both of you. To our audience, we certainly invite your feedback and commentary, so please do get in touch with us. Let us know what you think and what you're seeing at your own organizations. A great way to do this is, if you have not yet done so, please take DRI's annual Global Risk and Resilience Survey and share it with your colleagues, by email, on LinkedIn, on other social platforms, etc. The link will be reshared in the follow-up materials for this webinar, together with instructions for how to access the white paper and the recording of today's discussion. We are so grateful for you taking the time to contribute to the profession. Today's webinar has been a production of DRI International, all rights reserved. A recording will be made available on our website and the link will be shared. You will also receive a link to the survey. Please fill that out. Thank you for joining us and see you next time.